Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Very good to see so many people here in another brilliant event. My name's Robert Toombs. I'm here to talk to John Gray, and I don't need to say much about him because the fact that you're all here means that you know who he is already. He was Professor of the History of European Thought at the LSE. He's been at Essex, Oxford, Yale, Harvard, and other places. He's written about 20 books, and he has an asteroid named after him, which I think is probably somewhat unusual for a British academic, at least one in the humanities, and probably of philosophers since the 17th century. There are not very many who could claim something like that. He's been praised by a remarkable, and indeed criticized by a remarkable variety of people. Among the praisers has been Will Self, George Soros, Hayek, and I think not many people can claim to have been even read, let alone discussed or praised by such a wide spectrum of opinion as that. He's going to speak. I'm going to listen very carefully, and then he and I are going to have a conversation. And that's all I think I need to say. So, John, over to you.
Thank you, Robert, for that very generous introduction. I suppose the first thought that occurred to me when I was asked to do this by Patrick was that this is a time of great uncertainty. We all feel it in politics and in the whole world, in world events. Making sense of them is difficult, and we all turn to perhaps philosophers or great political leaders for some sense of how to react to this uncertainty. And then a story of General de Gaulle, a leader I admire very much, came into my mind. And I'll begin with that because I think it's got a certain core of truth in it, as well as an element of humor. In 1968, when the student revolution occurred in Paris, de Gaulle was asked to go to the university quarter and wandered about a bit with some journalists, and he came upon a wall on which there was graffiti, and loosely translated, because it was actually less polite than what I'm going to say, it said, "Kill all the fools." And he turned to a journalist and murmured, "A vast project." A man of great wisdom, I think. But I think it's an observation that applies in this country. The doctrines, we face a vast project of curbing, resisting, not, I think, eradicating, but somehow partially detoxifying the follies of our time, which have reached, I think, a peak. Not the ultimate peak, sadly, perhaps, but one of the peaks. Because the doctrines that have governed us over the past 3 decades have left us adrift, I think, in rather perilous waters. Ultra-liberal theories of human rights have led to a condition of lawlessness, in which the state is experienced as a weak and arbitrary power, presiding over an unfolding anarchy, in which justice has given way to the protection of self-identified communities and identities. Unending difficulties in expelling illegal immigrants who have committed serious crimes, and the, to my mind, still scandalously under-investigated grooming scandal are among the results. Some who look on this situation with dismay, as I think everyone should, think the way out is through a radical rejection of liberal values. I think this is a mistake, but it is true that some of our difficulties come from within the liberal tradition in the longer sense. As I'll say later on, I think liberalism took a fateful wrong turn when it became a secular religion, as it did when the canonical British liberal John Stuart Mill embraced Auguste Comte's religion of humanity. I should mention I speak with some feeling here because I spent 20 years of my life as a Mill scholar. I won't say they were entirely wasted, but I sometimes look back with a pang. The hyperbolical liberalism of the past 2 decades is a successor to this religion of humanity, this ersatz faith, without Mill's saving doubt, because Mill was actually a rather resourceful, self-critical thinker, unlike many of his subsequent followers. It doesn't follow, though, I think, that liberal values can be rejected outright. Rather, we should look at where they come from, their history, and how they apply today. My view, which differs from some historians of ideas, is that the roots of British liberalism, and perhaps even of liberalism more generally, in that broad sense, the word liberal didn't come into general use as a descriptor for a political movement or theory or project until the 19th century in Spain, but we can see this longer liberal tradition in Britain and elsewhere from the 16th century or even earlier and onwards. The ultimate roots of it, I believe, are in Jewish and Christian religion. The ultimate roots are in Jesus's distinction between Caesar and between basically what is owed to Caesar and what is owed to God, which I think was the starting point of what we now call a secular view of the state. And later Augustine's insight that the city of God can never be built on the earth. So we have to realize that we're all broken human beings, and therefore we should exercise tolerance in regard to the follies and vices of others. But then there's a delicate point to which I'll also return, which is we don't want the tolerance of sheer weakness, the tolerance of sheer acceptance. There are some things which cannot be negotiable. There are some points that have got to be defended to the very end. But the roots of liberalism, of liberal values, and of the liberal tradition in Christianity and Judaism have been forgotten, I think, or even denied. But they come really from the struggles for freedom of conscience of believers in the late medieval and early modern period. Despite that, the view of politics and of our present situation that I'll invoke is rooted more in skepticism than in faith, and this is partly because it arises from reading and indeed talking with Michael Oakeshott, after whom this series of lectures is named, over a period of about 15 years before he died in 1990. And during those conversations, we shared a common view, a common admiration for Hobbes. He wrote some very interesting and notable introductions and essays on Hobbes's thought, and for a certain kind of Hobbesian skepticism in politics, which is summarized in a few lines of his, which have become famous, which I'll read out. He wrote this was collected in his book. It was originally a speech in his Rationalism and Politics and other essays. He says, "In political activity, then, men sail a boundless and bottomless sea. There is neither harbor for shelter nor floor for anchorage, neither starting place nor appointed destination. The enterprise is to keep afloat on an even keel." It's a very skeptical view, but I found it appealing then, and I find it appealing now. It led me to my present view, which is that there's something uniquely relevant in Hobbes's thought at the present time, and I would say especially for this country. Because one of Hobbes's insights, not everything in his theory can be accepted, but not everything in his philosophy can be accepted. We have here, I think, the world's greatest living expert on Hobbes, who can correct me when I go wrong, and Noel Malcolm, to whom I defer on that. But I think in Hobbes, there is the insight that a sovereign that can maintain the peace is the basis of political obligation. If there isn't a sovereign, or there isn't one that can keep the peace, then the bonds of obligation and of duty are dissolved. That sovereign, and it can be a person, a king or a dictator, or but it can also be an institution. It can be democratic, or non-democratic. It can be imperial, or the head of a nation state. It can be any of these things. But if it doesn't maintain the peace and protect the security of its subjects, they can overturn, they can resist, disobey, overturn, and even kill the sovereign. And in that sense, I think it is a liberal theory. Some people balk at that, but the best historians of political ideas that I know supported it. Not only Oakeshott, he didn't like the word liberal, but he thought Hobbes was more of a liberal than anything else. The American conservative political theorist, very influential in American conservatives, Leo Strauss, and also perhaps a semi-forgotten figure, the Canadian Marxist C.B. Macpherson, who wrote a book called The Political Theory of Possessive Individualism. They all say Hobbes is not just a liberal, but he actually sort of in some sense started liberalism as a theory, And I think that's right, because ultimately government depends not on divine right or on superior wisdom, as in Plato. It depends on the consent of the governed, and the governed really being given what they're promised, and what Hobbes thinks they need more than anything else to protect them from each other is peace, is enforceable peace. And remember, in his marvelously terse observations, the covenant without the sword is nothing. It's but a word of no avail to a man at all. There has to be the sword. There has to be enforcement. And so for Hobbes, government exists to preserve the peace. It is not, though, therefore, a minimum state that can do nothing else. It isn't restrained in its pursuit of peace by fixed rights, as perhaps in Locke it might have been. But it isn't limited to the courts, the army, and the system of justice and prisons, as a classical libertarian minimum state is. When I used to know Hayek, and I was talking about Hayek's theory, I was often asked what was Hayek's theory of the state, and I used to reply, I think it's entirely accurate. Hayek believed any decent state would have an army, police force, the prisons, and a state opera. Hayek was Viennese. He did believe that. It was unthinkable for him that there would be no state involvement in the arts. And that distinguished him from some of the Anglosphere liberals who were horrified by that idea. But the Hobbesian state, as I understand it, can do whatever is necessary for peace, which may include preserving from poverty and lack of employment opportunities, and from having no productive place in society, groups or individuals or whole regions or cities and towns that are left by economic change, technological change, and globalization, as we now call it, without a productive role in society. So the Hobbesian state could have a role in intervening, I think, in the economy to do that, because that can be a precondition of peace. If large numbers of society, huge areas become post-industrial wastelands, and large numbers in the middle classes become extremely precarious in their finances and deeply dissatisfied with their economic future, as happened, I believe, in America when Trump first won. And even now is one of the chief sources of his support, then peace may come into question. So, and also I think universities have a role, which Hobbes recognized. He has a famous, I think from Behemoth, if I can remember, he said, the universities have been to this nation as the wooden horse was to the Trojans. A, marvelously concise and terse, as Hobbes often is, and secondly, very, very prescient. It did, in fact, turn out mad doctrines which had been incubated in universities were imagined that they could be just remain there and they'd do no harm. They didn't, they spread. And they were inculcated in millions and millions of young people. And if this had perhaps even happened before in schools. And I think they are one of the chief difficulties we face now, to which I'll also refer, in that what we now have, I think, in many Western countries and certainly in Britain, is a ruling ideology, the ruling ideology or view of the world, worldview of many contemporary Western states is anti-Western. And that's a rather profound difficulty, I think, that we face. Now, I won't, my interlocutor, Robert, is much more of an expert on this, so I won't say much, but the British system of parliamentary government, as we knew it until a few decades ago, emerged in a time of civil war and revolution, and part of the title of this talk refers to the British revolutionary tradition. And when I started thinking about what I would say, I didn't start thinking about the diggers or the levelers or others, though I could have done. But I thought instead of how Britain's uniquely political constitution, it's not unwritten, there are lots of documents in which it's partly codified, but it's not systematic in the way that the constitutions of France or America are. But I began thinking about how this uniquely unfixed constitution enabled revolutions to happen in non-revolutionary ways. Revolutions happen through new political settlements, which emerged from within the system and were accepted. And none of us here can have experienced the emergence of that parliamentary government in the 17th century, but some of us are, some in you in the audience are old enough to remember when the post-war settlement in Britain, which I think for its period was rather a decent one and rather a successful one, the settlement that emerged from 1945 onwards to the mid-70s, gave way initially, I think, actually under Labour. It was Dennis Healey, not Margaret Thatcher, who began to depart from the Keynesian orthodoxy that had prevailed in those 30 years since the war. So the Thatcherite economic revolution began before Thatcher. That was a profound transformation, in some respects, I think, highly beneficial, and in others, not only harmful, but even in some respects, self-defeating. Because one of the respects in which it was self-defeating, I think, was that Thatcher didn't begin or cause the decline of traditional British industry. It's been going on by some accounts, the historian Curly Barnett would suggest, since the late 19th century. But she accelerated it, and she left a lot of communities, millions of people, basically on life support from welfare. They were just left to get on with it, which in many cases, I think, did lead over a period of decades to what had been hard-working, industrious communities with solid families becoming swamps of drug use and of other illegal industries and of three-generation joblessness, a catastrophe, which we're now left with. I admired Thatcher then, I admire her still today, she was a great leader, but it had this deep irony that actually what happened was that the state expanded under Thatcher and at the same time became weaker. And then later, under subsequent Conservative and Labour governments, its Hobbesian core actually became hollowed out, I think. Defence, the police, the prisons, they were all shrunk or deprived of funds, while the welfare state continued its expansion. So although many Conservatives blame Blair, especially, and there's something in that for our present situation, in this and other respects, I think it actually goes back, oddly enough, to Thatcher. And I think anyone who is honest about why we are where we are should recognise. Now, neither civil war nor revolution in the classical sense is likely in Britain today. We're too multiply fragmented to produce a civil war, I think. Won't happen here. Something like it could happen in France, although it would be a traditional regime change, a new republic perhaps. Something like it could even happen in America, though there too, I think it's much more likely that there'd be a long period of, possibly long period of lawlessness rather than a repetition of the Civil War. In Britain, I think the real threat isn't that. It's of decline into ungovernability. It's of the inability to actually reinvent a state, which I think would have to be by reinventing the powers of a sovereign parliament and enabling that state to control the machinery of government, of which it's lost control of many of the mechanisms of government. When Thatcher pulled the lever in government, something happened. Very often now, nothing happens. But there's a second difference between then and now, which, having observed Thatcher a little bit in action, I think is very important, which is she didn't have to confront with a society in which practically every intermediary institution had been captured by one or two local governments had, Liverpool and so on, but museums weren't captured, universities weren't captured as they are now, art galleries weren't, the National Trust wasn't, a whole range of institutions which are now strongly influenced by, or even vehicles of, instruments of this anti-Western progressive ideology, didn't exist. The intermediary institutions were what was then called apolitical. One of the signs of the barbarism of our times is that everything's political. We'll only get back to civilization of some kind when it's the case that much of life isn't political. The obvious paradox is we can only get back to that by intense political action. And we shouldn't be afraid of looking at those paradoxes. They're real. So if there is a regime change brewing in Britain at the moment, which I think there probably is, it will be a revolutionary restoration of a sovereign parliament at the head of a strong and effective state. And as I've just said, if that doesn't happen, then we're in for a period of great of decline into ungovernability. Now, I think decline can be resisted, even now in this country and elsewhere. But I do sort of insist on the fact that decline is a real thing. I mean, one of the features of recent thinking is that it hasn't exactly been cancelled. The decline is always used pedagogically. If we can see these points of decay, they're deeply instructive, even inspiring, because we can reverse them. Not always so. I think we still can, actually, in this country. Still a reasonable possibility, but absolutely no certainty. I'll mention one other feature of the Hobbesian feature of our current situation, which is important in this respect, which is that we live in a time when the so-called rule-governed order internationally has broken down, imploded, I would think, partly from overreach, partly from the misguided wars that were evangelical wars, which are fought by the Western powers, without any clear idea of what they wanted. Did they want regime change? Were they doing it to suppress terrorism? Why were they doing it? It was never clear. So we had the disaster in Iraq and the even perhaps greater disaster in Afghanistan, which, God forbid, could be repeated, I think, in Ukraine. And we don't any longer have a rule-governed order. We have one in which basically force rules. Now, that's, I think, a feature of that which is less understood than it should be, is that that anarchy has, so to speak, spilled over into, seeped into the domestic politics of Western countries. Elections in seats that are now marginal, that weren't before, or were before, can be decided on issues of foreign policy by parties whose principal principal concern is with foreign policy. The largest demonstrations that we have are about particular aspects of the foreign policy of the West, insofar as there is still a Western foreign policy, or of the United States in particular. And here too I see the influence of anti-Western ideology, because I can't help noticing that so many of these demonstrations are about the situation in the Middle East. There are not many about Sudan, where there is a tremendous genocide occurring. The genocidal assaults on the Yazidi in post-Saddam Iraq, which were truly terrible, are hardly ever mentioned. There are none that I'm aware of against the happened at the time or later, or against the destruction, complete leveling and razing to the ground of the capital city of Chechnya, Grozny, by the Russians, mass rape, torture, and all the rest of it. And why is this the case? I think the deep reason is this ideology which identifies the situation in the Middle East as a struggle between a last outpost of Western colonialism and these other forces. And I think that's the reason. So we have to understand that if we are to understand our present situation, which is that one aspect of globalization which persists even when globalization as an economic system fragments or disintegrates, as it is doing, is that domestic politics are globalized. Domestic politics become vehicles for global struggles, as they do now. And that, of course, leads, in the British case, to the possibility that whole elections or governments could be determined by who was elected in particular constituencies on this basis, and it also leads to leading politicians in the present government and other parties being extremely cautious about expressing any heterodox thoughts they may have, if they have such thoughts, as yet unproven, but anyway, let's assume that some of them do, on any of these issues, because they could be, if they're in an ultra-marginal seat, it could affect the outcome of the next election, and, for example, the outcome of the next Labour leader. Some of the candidates are in these marginal seats. So it's a very profound transformation of our politics. Of course, we've always had, I'm old enough, I actually attended one of the big anti-Vietnam demonstrations in 1968, so we've always had these, but they were not central to our politics the way they are now. There weren't separate parties that represented a strong view on these issues, and the forces didn't go after particular MPs the way they do now. So I think that's an important point that we should bear in mind. I'll now talk just briefly about another factor of the present situation, which I think is key to reinventing a Hobbesian state, and then I'll conclude with some of the difficulties about which I'll talk with Robert later. I think one thing we've got to overcome is the fetishization or the fundamentalization of rights. Rights can be important. There are some present here tonight who favor a British Bill of Rights, a kind of minimal, slimmed-down version of restraints on government, which could be important in protecting citizens from the abuse of power by governments in the present and in the future. But when rights become obstacles to peace and security, when we can't actually remove threats, criminals or people detained as potential criminals for serious offences, because they can launch long and complex legal procedures which basically thwart this, I think rights have then become enemies of civil peace. And some way around this legalism has to be found, but it maybe have to be something in a way like a withdrawal from the European Convention, because I think what we need to recognize is that what began after the Second World War as the formulation of what Hobbes might call articles of peace that any reasonable, decent human being could accept, rights now have become the vehicle for a particular political project. They're systematically tilted in such a way that they serve a project of a borderless world, a world without nations, or which nations have no real power, in which the demand for control of borders is seen as a form of atavism, or at least or even of implicit racism. And I think in that and many other respects, we have to get away from the centrality of rights in our politics. Back in 1993, I wrote a piece in which I said, if America ever comes a cropper, it might be because of the constitutionalization of abortion. Because you should not have rights established which are deeply controversial in society. It should only be a minimum which most reasonable people can endorse. What happens, and this is what happened, though it took 30 years, if you entrench a right to a freedom that a third or more of the society regards with abomination, if you entrench that in law and the courts, what then happens is law and the courts become targets of political capture. And 30 years later, Trump did sack the courts and did then enable his full-scale control of the American justice system. He basically owns the American political justice system now. Finally, not everything can be negotiable. A very important point. rather than trying to resurrect a deep national culture, a deep common set of values that we all share, I think what we need is to look for ways of achieving modus vivendi among communities and individuals that don't share the same values, don't share the same faiths, don't share the same ways of life. But in other words, Hobbesian articles of peace. But some things, I think, are non-negotiable or should be, and they all come down, I think many people will find this a kind of slightly counterintuitive, but I think actually we need to look at the bearers of rights, the bearers of important freedoms, should not be communities, but individuals. Because individuals belong to several communities, they want to move from one to the other, they shouldn't be stopped, they shouldn't be harassed by members of other communities. We need to change them, and that involves all faiths, all religions should, I think, have protection. But we should beware of any protection against hate speech, for example, that implicitly brings back the offense of blasphemy. We should beware of ones which, whether they benefit one community, one religion more than another, they curb curb freedom of speech. I mean, that's where liberalism started, I think. Liberalism started, and that's where, if it's going to be revived, it has to be revived. So I'll end by saying the decomposition of liberalism as a worldview is evident. It doesn't match the world. There's very little in the world that it matches. And yet, the institutions and the people who have promoted this view can remain in power, they can remain entrenched in our institutions for a long time after it's disintegrated. They're still there hanging on, not much weaker than they were before. So reality may not prevail. We may have a situation in which the millions of young people who have been indoctrinated in this ideology become more extreme, and their elders who indoctrinated them in it continue to persecute and cancel and silence doubters. And that's why what we're doing tonight, I think, is so important. We have to prepare for the long haul rather than for some sudden victory that might occur. As General de Gaulle might have put it, setting aside folly in politics is a vast project.
Well, thank you very much, John, for that, which has given us all a great deal to think about. And I have the rather formidable job of trying to, as it were, express some of the questions that people here might have, as well as the ones I have myself, and asking you to perhaps enlarge on some of the points that you made. You and Hobbes are pessimists, I think.
Surely not.
That's pretty clear. And indeed, you've talked about the pessimism of strength, pessimism as facing reality. And yet one could say that Hobbes's vision is a kind of utopia too, a different kind of utopia. And I suppose a common sense difference between utopia and, let's say, the pessimism of realism is that you can do something about it. And you suggested that things can be done and that we have to prepare for a long struggle. But I wonder if you could say a bit more about what in practice we do. And I wonder whether you think that what we will have to wait for is the sort of disaster, some sort of shock, some sort of domestic or international shock that will sweep away the old system. The sort of thing that Hobbes himself had lived through. Well, let's hopefully not as bad as that, but it could be worse, as you have suggested. But do we need some sort of shock that will make our politics unrecognizable from what they are today, or do you see something within our present political system that could be used to bring about the sort of changes that that you've said, and I think many of us would agree are needed?
Well, I guess one fact, I think it is a fact which is clear, is that the progressives who form the majority in most of the political parties and in the present government won't give up their power voluntarily. They won't suddenly see the error of their ways. They won't turn around and say, you know, this idea of progress, it's all rubbish that we've had. It's very narrow. People don't like it. I don't think they do say that to each other in their private moments. If they said that, there would be progress. If there was any recognition of the flaws in the ruling idea of progress, that would be progress. I don't expect it. So my answer to you is, yes, I think the replacement of this settlement or regime by a different regime most likely will occur through a bigger crisis than we've had up till now. And one way that could happen, I think I'm not an expert on the financial markets, I talk to people who are in them, is through a mega Truss event. Truss is a mockable figure, genuinely mockable, I think. But what she did was reveal the fragility of the British fiscal situation, its acute dependency on a quicksilver global capital for state funding. Rather than cause it herself, she revealed it. And a sudden assault on would provoke big changes, I mean changes which are now politically impossible, I think, despite the fact that the present government claims it's going to make them, on cutting down on welfare payments and, for example, what's urgently necessary, I think most of us would agree in spending more, and more wisely, of course, but spending more on defense just simply won't happen without a crisis like that. So that's why. And the other, sadly, is war. War in Europe. It's by no means clear that the coalition of the willing can preserve Ukraine from a stalemate or a frozen conflict in which the parts of the country still remain under Russian rule, or even that the lack of funds, assuming the Russian assets aren't released, which they should be, but for this purpose. But it's a long legal process. Not all of the components of the coalition of the willing agree on how it should be done, and some European states are opposed to it being done. It's not clear that Ukraine will really survive as a truly independent state in these circumstances. So I think war could change things. If we were in a situation where Britain was actually at risk, serious risk, it already is, according to some accounts, actually, from some accounts, the Russian state is already at war with us from its point of view. But if that becomes a palpable reality with cyber attacks on hospitals and airports and so on every day, so to speak, then that might trigger it. So I think we do probably need that, because to be shaken out of an ideology that has conquered all of the parties pretty well, that for 20 or 30 years, that was propagated in schools, that all the people regarded as the most sagacious, the adults in the room, shared, takes it's a big cognitive hit, because it's not just a change in political allegiance or a change in political belief, it's a whole worldview that goes out of the window. And it's very hard to accept that. So yes, I do think we need that, Robert. The question then is whether we have the resources to learn from it, because one of the things, I mean, Oakeshott relied on, and that he presupposed, was a skillful political class, which perhaps we had in those days, and that was a political class. He died, I think, in 1990. A political class, he certainly fought in the Second World War and so on. Many of them came out of the Second World War, Dennis Healey on the Labour side, for example, knowing what it meant to take life and death decisions, knowing that many things are time sensitive. We're being, the enemy, sir, is 100 yards away. What should we do? Well, we'll have a seminar on it. That's what we'll do. No, that isn't what they could do. They had to make a decision, and they had to make it quick, even because it involved life and death. Healy was on the beaches in Normandy, I think, making those decisions. He was beachmaster. So I think there has been a decline in the standard of leadership. And so one of the sources of Oakeshott's thought is less is weaker now than it used to be, because it's not clear that our existing ruling class has this skill to deal with changing situations intelligently. And if it doesn't, we might not learn quickly enough or not learn the right lessons. You might just have general confusion. For example, the next election, if it happens, whenever it happens, it could happen earlier than scheduled because of a financial crisis, but whenever it happens, if it produces a parliament of 7 or 8 parties, a sort of semi-chaotic coalition situation, what kind of government will come out of it? It could be a progressive government, another progressive government. Everyone says progressive. Even I say progressivism is dead. And I think, well, not quite dead yet. It may Lazarus-like emerge for a bit longer. And it would probably be more radical, because on the left, the progressive left of politics, new forces are emerging quite quickly in the so-called Green Party. I say that because it's not really about greenery anymore, it's about other issues, and elsewhere. So one could have another lease on life, so to speak, of progressivism, which would then break down later for fiscal, if not other reasons, but probably in the context of an even deeper crisis. So somehow, we've got to produce people who can handle the contingencies of politics, who know how to do that. And that, I think, is a very urgent issue.
Well, I can't help thinking that although I share your admiration for Denis Healey and his generation, they were the ones who produced the last great shock we had, which was the Winter of Discontent and all that, and
that's true.
Brought about what a sort of deus ex machina, which was Margaret Thatcher, whom no one expected to be capable of doing the things that she did. So we can't really, we can speculate, but we can't in any way be sure that the sort of shock that you're imagining, or we're all imagining, could either just accelerate our ungovernability, or it could produce some salutary shock. And there are a couple of things that I wonder about, and I wonder what you think about. One is, as you said, do we still have the resources to cope? And it seems to me that the kind of government that you have outlined, a Hobbesian government, is in many ways what most people want. Is what most people they want a government that does not practice two-tier justice. They want equality before the law. They want protection for freedoms of speech. They want protections for their own property. They want security in the streets. They want the country to be defended. And that seems to me still to be the overwhelming consensus. And I think you doubt that it is. And I don't know how we would know until it's actually being tested.
That's the trouble.
That's the trouble. And you, like Hobbes, think that the universities well, Hobbes said that they're the fountain of civil and moral, whatever wisdom, I can't quite remember the phrase. And you've quoted him rather differently in talking about them as the Trojan horse. The
wooden horse. Yeah.
And I know that you've said that you think that a Hobbesian state would have the right and the duty to make sure that a positive history of the country would be taught. That implies that all is not lost in a way. It implies, I think, that there might still be something that can be saved. And I do think perhaps you're being more pessimistic than I would be about the state of public opinion, and whether the public would not, in fact, majority would not, in fact, rally to a government that would do many of the things that you want done. And if that's the case, it is, as you suggested, the fact that there is a class which seems to me a parasitical one. It's a strong word, but parasites by their nature damage the organism on which they depend, who have, as you said, taken control of very many of our institutions, if not most, but have done so without the consent of the majority and exercise the powers that they have by avoiding accountability. Maybe they are more fragile than they look, and it may be that the kind of control that they exercise can be shaken rather more easily than by some sort of cataclysm.
I would wish that were true, and there's some reasons to think that way. I mean, there are two things that can be done at least two things about universities, one of which is what Faris here in Oxford is doing, which is to produce scholars and fund scholars who can be a new generation of thinkers and researchers who do not embody this ideology. They may have a wide range of different political views. They may be theists or non-theists. They may be liberals or radical conservatives, Tories. Some of them might even be socialists of an old-fashioned sort. That's one thing. The other thing, I guess, would be a free speech act with teeth. I mean, there was one under the last government, which was inherited, but has been watered down. Probably doesn't mean very much. And it would have to have teeth, because if young scholars particularly aren't sure what will happen to them if they say something heterodox, they won't say it. The present regime of self-censorship will go on. So we can do things in universities. But your deeper question, Robert, was whether I was right in wondering whether there's still, and how strong there still is, a majority culture which wants something like a decent Hobbesian government. And I think there probably is, at the moment, a majority in favour of that. I'm not so sure 10 years from now. Because remember, you used this strong, but not, I think, unjustifiably strong word of parasite. Parasites multiply. I mean, people have often said, well, isn't this the rule of this stuff in university? It's just fashion. It changes in fashion. Fashions change. And I said, no, it's not the same. It's not the same, because in fashions which are strongly exposed to public opinion and to markets and to other factors, they do change. But in universities and other institutions like it, people appoint their successors. And they restructure the entire career ladder according to these ideological, if they can, these ideological requirements. So it's not the case that they'll all get bored with it one day. I mean, fashion changes sometimes from boredom. It's not to say, my God, I've been arguing for critical race studies for the last 20 years. Very tedious. Why don't I argue against it? Now, I would love to meet such a person. There may even be such people, but there are not many, I don't think. They'll simply go on robotically doing it to the very end. They won't have the sense of reality which even the Soviet nomenclatura had. They knew the game was up. A lot of them, it wasn't up for them, by the way, economically. They went on to benefit from privatizations, and as they had from the old regime. But they treated the Soviet ideology with the contempt they'd always had for it. When I traveled in those countries at one time, it took roughly 2.5 glasses of vodka to move from everyone subscribing to it to some people at least saying the situation here is absolutely ghastly. The difference here, and it's a profound difference, is that many of the supporters of many of the believers in progressive ideology, in quotes, really believe it. In the Soviet world, there were two worlds. There was the world of what people lived in privately with their loved ones and trusted ones. There was always a risk there, but they coped with it. Apparently, the Western nomenclature hasn't got the flexibility and subtlety of mind to keep those two worlds. They really believe whatever it is that the ideology tells them is true, which can change, of course, over time, but they go along with that too. And so I think that it's very difficult to be confident that a majority, a decent, so to speak, healthy, common sense of a majority that wants to use the old phrase, rub along together, which says things like, it takes all sorts to take a world. If you said that nowadays, you'd probably be considered a crypto-Nazi. Well, you know, why shouldn't people have different ways of living as long as there is mutual consent and respect and so on? I'm not confident that will always be the case. And what that would mean is you could have a society without a dominant majority culture. Not a different one necessarily immediately, not a monolithically progressive one, but one in just which there are several kind of different blocks, which I think may already be the case in the United States. And that's a very difficult situation to get out of, actually, because how do you do it? I don't think we're fortunate compared with the United States and with France, in that our constitution would still permit a reconfiguration in politics around something like that, if there was if a shock was administered. Even then, as I mentioned earlier, there's no certainty. But I think it could still happen because we're not as polarized. And a kind of a solid dominant, a solid majority of pragmatic, sensible, skeptical, they may be believers or not believers, but they're willing to live with each other. That still exists, but I don't know, only just, particularly when you look at the age structures. As you go down the age structures, you find more and more people swallowing the, now, in a sense, cognitively bankrupt, but swallowing the progressive ideology. Yep.
So what should the citizens of a Hobbesian state believe? Or, should they not believe too much of anything? And the reason I ask that is because it seemed to me that in a time of pretty well universal literacy, unlike in Hobbes's time, there is not going to be such a passive willingness to accept the rule of a sovereign, and therefore there has to be some sort of, well, of course, as you said, Hobbes knew that consent was necessary, but consent now probably requires rather more than it did in Hobbes's time, some sort of rather positive agreement with what the government is doing, and therefore it seemed to me that probably a nation state is the only one that is really compatible with a Hobbesian kind of government. But maybe that's because I have this rather sentimental attachment to the idea of a consensus.
I guess at the back of our thought, back of this question is whether rescuing our society from lawlessness and further decline requires the reconstruction of a monocultural nation state, and whether that's possible. And here I look even beyond the European world and the Western world, and there are various possibilities, but none of them really fit us. For example, in Japan, which I know slightly, is a monocultural state, partly because it's had very little immigration till recently. There, a Hobbesian state, which exists in a relatively mild form there, I think, actually, can rely on a common national culture. But take a different non-Western example, Singapore. Singapore is multicultural. They call themselves multicultural because there are different ethnicities, particularly, but it sustains itself, I think, through a very profound degree of government intervention in everyday life, and in housing particularly. So in housing, there are laws and practices and quotas which prohibit what's sometimes called ghettoization, or single ethnic groups taking over, deciding to live together to the exclusion of others. So that's a situation where you have a functioning, viable multicultural, been very successful economically in other ways, more than almost any Western state, I would say, if not all Western states. But it requires a very, very active state. Now, I don't think that's possible in Britain any more than Japanese monoculturalism is possible. Partly, of course, our state machine wouldn't have the administrative capacity to do it. People would be wandering from one to the other and getting lost and being deported from one ghetto to another and given £500 on the way and then forgotten about, or whatever. But basically because it would be too great of a violation of individual freedoms that now exist. You just can't do it. So we have to be, so I don't think that with the situation as it is in Britain today, partly as a result of a long period of very large-scale and rapid immigration, and partly because of changes in British society itself, which didn't have anything to do with that, such as the emergence in Mill and later on in the Bloomsbury group of whole ways of life that are not based on marriage and traditional moralities. I mean, that happened of its own accord over a long period. I've said in something I wrote recently, hyperliberalism is Nietzsche for the masses. So the idea that you could invent yourself, treat your life as a work of art, that you don't need to live in families, that you don't need to have a fixed identity, you can just invent it as you go along. That idea, which Mill took from German Romanticism, spread partly through his influence and then later from the Bloom's group, right throughout society. So what was a kind of an elite pose has become a mass philosophy. So I don't think that's going to go away, nor should it in a way now, because of too much of what human life has become, too much of the way we live now. It has its costs and dangers. Family instability is a very profound thing, and I think some laws and policies need to be changed to make having families, having children easier than it is for many people. But the idea that this so to speak, prelapsarian form of life certainly didn't exist in the Georgian period, by the way, but you might say pre-Victorian way of life could be reconstructed, I think is an illusion. So I don't think there's enough, there's some, it varies from country to country, and in Britain there's something left in Britain of a common majority culture, of a vague but nonetheless still potent and effective, that we can draw on. But that doesn't mean we can become Japan or become what we were, let's say, immediately after the Second World War. I mean, one of the interesting things, ironies of Thatcher, is that the world she wanted to recreate, a solid sense of nationhood, deference, hard work, a certain kind of hierarchy based in morality and in merit, was a creation of the Labour government of 1945. It was a creation of Labour collectivism. It was a creation of the Second World War, basically. We can't go back to that, even if we have a really big war now, because it would be quite a different war. So we have to somehow, and it may not be possible, but I think it's worth trying, to get a Hobbesian state and a sovereign parliament without the full backing of such a common culture. And there are people who say, well, we need to get the common culture back first. How can we do that? The little platoons, Burke's little platoons, are controlled by, conquered by, captured by, funded by, or defunded by the state. So actually the political struggle just comes first. We regret this, I regret it. I don't want to live in a society where everything is politics, or even when it takes up. What was it Oscar Wilde said in his essay on socialism? It does so use up one's evenings, socialism. And we don't want government by people who enjoy using up their evenings in that way either. And I hope we don't need it, but it's intense politics that can do it and nothing else. Simply drafting a new constitution, like the French or the Americans trying to get back to their original constitution, which is disputed, but even if we had it, won't work either. We can see that in both cases. The power, the force, the energy of these, both of progressivism and of its shadow, whatever you want to call it, hyper nationalism or ethno-nationalism, is too strong. It just breaks through all these rules or these constitutional provisions.
What I don't quite understand is where the sovereign, where sovereignty would lie. What would the sovereign be in a society which has so greatly, degenerated, I suppose, or fragmented?
In Britain, it would be Parliament, what it was. I mean, I remember when Parliament was sovereign. This was how Thatcher was able to do. You might think it was disastrous, but how Thatcher was able to do what she did. We belonged to certain international treaties, but we actually didn't always follow them. We didn't in Northern Ireland, for example. We didn't in the case of votes for prisoners. We belonged to the European Convention on Human Rights, but it wasn't incorporated into UN law, into British law until I think 2002, and then became fully by Blair. That's when it was. Before that, it wasn't. So Parliament was genuinely sovereign in those days, and very contentious issues, less so than in America, were resolved. So, for example, the question of the regulation of abortion, which is a very fraught issue in America, was resolved on a basis I thought was quite reasonable. I'm a moderate pro-choice person on that issue. I abominate the fact that now enacted, it appears as law that the right of choice can extend up to the moment of birth. It's no longer abortion, it's infanticide, so, but we need a balance somewhere, I think. And people who take fundamental strong positions of rights can argue with each other and their citizens, common citizens, and come up with something they can live with for the while, for the time being, which can be modified and renegotiated as things change, as public opinion changes, technology changes, people's attitudes changes, and so on. So we had a system of unfettered parliamentary sovereignty, lots of conventions, lots of tacit understandings about what Parliament couldn't and shouldn't do, but it did have this profound legal. I think we can get back to that. The difficulty is, of course, as I mentioned earlier, and as you mentioned, Rob, the difficulty is partly we've lost many of those tacit conventions, tacit understandings. I remember someone asking someone from Chatham House what Chatham House rules were. He said, well, I'm not actually quite sure what they are. Well, how's anyone to know? I mean, we have lost them. They've been eroded partly. And we've also lost some of the political skills. Now, you might think that's a kind of a watery sort of sovereignty, but it is what, the question is, can it be reinvented or reimagined? Not exactly as it was, because too much has changed, but it did work for quite a long period. It did provide. When did it start going to? I think when constitutional changes were introduced, which took the opportunity for collective parliamentary decision-making by way of a kind of dialogue or conversation or argument, took that away from Parliament and installed the powers either in courts or in quangos, whose virtue, it was said, was to be independent of Parliament. They said, well, they're experts. Well, are there really experts on many of these questions? I mean, I don't want to attack the idea of expertise. I think there is expertise in epidemiology, actually. I'm a bit worried about developments in America which cast doubt on, there's reasonable doubt in some areas of how we reacted to COVID, but I'm a bit worried about the attack on all expertise. But can anyone really be happy if their life or death is determined by a panel of experts? Which is how, I'm a moderate supporter of assisted dying, actually. But I wouldn't support the present bill under any circumstances. Not only because it coincides with a period of extreme scarcity of resources in the health service, but also because it's gradually moved from some, maybe even then not enough, legal restrictions in which judges and courts, to one of which, well, we'll bring in an expert. Who are experts on these questions of life or death? Do they tot up the utiles, like in, well, it looks to me we've got 42 utiles here, if he agrees to pop off. And at the moment, by not popping off, it's 300 utiles. That's what it's costing. Clear cut. I mean, I'm mocking, I'm ridiculing, I'm parodying what would happen. It wouldn't be quite like that. I don't believe there are experts in this, because what there are profound issues of ethics, the value of life, etc., which don't, they're not liable to be accommodated by that kind of calculation. So I think that's when it started to, and that's what got us into our present situation, very largely, because having devolved that power, that freedom, that authority of Parliament as a sovereign, a collective sovereign, with different parties, with different views, but nonetheless capable of making these deliberations. Let me make a point. Mill, for all, he never thought in the terms of legalism of fixed rights. He thought that law should be made by what he called an enlightened legislature. Now, he might have been sort of unclear or even wrong about what that would mean, but he thought a legislature like the British Parliament could, the UK Parliament could do. When it's very hard to bring it back because it involves dissolving these blob-like institutions or basically altering them against a background on which the skills that were involved in making these deliberations have withered. So it is difficult.
So it sounds as though the first step in a British revolution is to elect a government with a large majority that has a very clear view that its first job is to take back power from quangos, the courts, and indeed the civil service, and place it back into Parliament and hence into the hands of the people who are consenting to their sovereign ruler.
Yes.
That doesn't sound beyond the bounds of possibility, though it does. It clearly is more difficult than it would have been maybe, I don't know, 50 years ago.
It isn't impossible, but there are obvious risks. I mean, Reform is the party currently led by Nigel Farage is an obvious example of this, which is that that's something like what it wants to do, but it's recently reversed without much on spending. It's had a complete volte-face over spending, and a reasonable one. It's also changed its position on defence, again, I think, in a reasonable way. But I think a big problem is that if such a government was elected, be it reform or a reform-led government with some elements from the Conservative Party or other parties, would the disappointment that followed from its inability to enact all its policies, what would that do to public trust in government? And I think, by the way, I mentioned one risk which I think is separate from that. I myself feel that some of the debate about immigration has been, I'm a strong advocate, always have been. I've written about this in left-wing periodicals, which have been kind enough to allow me to do it for many, many years. I remain that, but I'm leery of proposals whereby people who've lived in this country legally for decades could be expelled. I think it's wrong, disruptive. Again, administratively impossible. They expel all the wrong people. They turn up at some Scottish village and people have lived there for hundreds of years and they expel the wrong ones. But it's just basically wrong to do that. And it goes against, I would say, some actually element of tacit British decency and so on. So I think there are, and if it's promised, and Farage actually has been, I think, more moderate than others who've left his party or try to catch up with his party in other ways. If it's promised, it won't be delivered, can't be delivered, but it'll sour the atmosphere in this country and deepen the crisis of trust, because then no one will trust anything. And so I think it's beholden on us, who are, many of us, critics of mass immigration, to hold the line on that, not to go that way in competitive upgrading. I mean, I've heard a French guru interviewed extreme anti-immigration. He said, well, when would you, how far would you go back? He said, well, 3 generations. The fact that there is such an absurd and repellent idea can even be voiced, I think, tells us something about how bad things have gotten. So I think we have to also, we on our side, have to observe a certain kind of restraint, both as to what is practical and to what is moral, and not then disappoint elements of the population which might want more than really can be delivered, or even in this case ought to be delivered.
Well, with that sober thought, I think perhaps we should stop. I was going to ask you about economic policy, but that would take another 3/4 of an hour, and I don't know.
And I might not know the answers.
But thank you very much indeed, John, for a very stimulating and alarming, a pessimistic, but a strong, a realistically pessimistic or a strongly pessimistic.
The long haul.
The long haul, yeah.
We've got to back the long haul and not give up on the way.
But we can be pessimistic without being despairing.
Yes.
And that's, I think, something that you have taught us. So thank you very much.